pre-order numbers for Metroid Prime 4 are promising. Very promising, actually, with Metroid Prime 4 sailing past Kirby Air Riders to the top of the eShop charts in the week before launch. But let's be honest, despite the Sakurai factor, Air Riders is quite a niche title in a series that historically has been modest selling outside of Japan. The real question is whether Metroid Prime 4 will have legs in the long term. What would good sales look like for Nintendo? What would excellent sales look like? And over what period? Let's deep dive the sales expectations of Metroid Prime 4. And to start with, we're going to look at some benchmarks which we could use to guide what we expect to happen. Firstly, Metroid's history on the Nintendo Switch. Now, to look at this, we should go back to November 2024, when Nintendo confirmed that, at that point, Metroid games on Switch had yet to pass the 5 million sales barrier. We know that as of December 2022, Metroid Dread had sold 3.07 million copies, which means that Metroid Prime Remastered had yet to hit 2 million in sales after nearly 2 full years on the market. Now, there are reasons for this, including the fact that it was shadow dropped and didn't have an awful lot of promotion, since Nintendo was really getting into the hype cycle of the Mario movie and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom in the months that followed. But then again, the digital-first release almost certainly led some hardcore fans to actually double dip, so they had a physical copy for collection purposes, as well as being able to play the game on day one. Plus, of course, the game was somewhat cheaper than was usual at only $40, although it's also been pointed out in the comments previously that perhaps this might have put people off the game, thinking it was potentially a lower quality title. And while all these numbers are head and shoulders above the combined 3DS and Wii U titles, since Metroid didn't have a Wii U game, and the two 3DS games were the widely disliked Metroid Prime Federation Force and the late in 3DS's life Metroid Samus Returns, it's not all that impressive a step up. Reportedly, the original Metroid Prime on GameCube scooped 2.8 million in sales on a system with about a seventh the installed base, so clearly there is some potential to go a lot higher than Metroid has in recent times. Let's consider the other end of the spectrum, though. The Xenoblade series has some similarities to Metroid, albeit with a Japanese skew to its audience rather than a Western one. The games are gorgeous, critically acclaimed, with a passionate audience and a low sales ceiling, despite some signs of progress on the Switch. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 had sold 1.86 million by the end of its first 8 months on the market, while Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition seemingly didn't cross a million, although by a quirk of when it released, it could have had just under a million in the financial year it launched in, and just under a million in this financial year, and still outsold Xenoblade Chronicles 3. Still, if we take 75,000 copies of X sold in the first week in Japan and 112,000 for 3 in the first week in Japan, and assume the same ratio applied across the board, then we're looking at, 1.2 million sales for the only Switch first-party game to release between February and September 2025. Metroid Prime 4 is obviously higher profile than Xenoblade Chronicles X, just from being an original game rather than a port of a spin-off, but if people feel like they're moving on from Switch, having a dual release may only have partial benefits. It's quite possible that people may decide that they'd rather hold off on Metroid Prime 4 until they can actually get their hands on a Switch 2, which of course they might not be able to afford imminently. Mind you, as well as Metroid Prime 4 being first on the eShop charts, the upgrade pack is 13th, which seems rather odd unless you assume that people really want the better view of the art on the Switch box, but also want the Switch 2 features. Now, we should recognise that because we're in the very early days of Switch 2, the sales numbers on the surface are not going to look too amazing right out of the gate, which isn't to say that those high sales numbers are impossible. Donkey Kong has had an intermittent sales record over the years, but Bonanza scored 3.49 million copies in the space of a couple of months, and with a smaller install base than Metroid Prime 4 will have. Of course, Prime is a very different proposition in sales terms than Bonanza, far more niche, far less family-friendly. Then again, while Metroid Prime 4 is clearly intended to be the Switch 2 Metroid Prime game that can carry through at least a substantial portion of the generation, it is also a Switch game, and should gain some degree of traction from this. So, what does this suggest? For the absolute upper band, and to be clear, this is so high it's downright unrealistic, I would think, we could take Bonanza's numbers, multiply them by, let's say, 1.5 to represent the greater numbers of Switch 2 sold now compared to the previous quarter, and there we could hope for maybe 4.5 million sales by the end of the quarter. I think it's very unlikely that Metroid Prime 4 will follow perfectly in the footsteps of Bonanza, but it would be a massive feather in Nintendo's cap if they were able to do this. Now, for the absolute lower band, we should probably assume that they capture only the core audience. Well, Federation Force showed that that core audience is actually a very low number indeed, and it's difficult to precisely measure the scope for Metroid Prime 4, but we know that by the end of March 2023, Metroid Prime Remastered had sold 1.09 million copies. Not all of those might want to return to have another game in the series if they were trying it out for the first time, but early adopters tend to be more hardcore, so let's assume that there's a baseline of about 250,000 people who purchased at lightning speed, the absolute bedrock audience who will follow Metroid Prime into anywhere it goes, even potentially into Miles Mackenzie land. So having given ourselves the outer tramlines of where Metroid Prime 4 will almost certainly be, 0.25 to 4.5 million, a massive gulf, let's try to get more specific. One point of comparison is the Wii. Donkey Kong Country Returns was, like Bonanza, a new departure for the ape, or at least an old departure, as it took the character back to its country roots for the first time in a decade and a half. Now that game scooped 6.53 million lifetime Wii sales. Metroid Prime 3 Corruption took 1.41 million. Albeit, I assume this doesn't include the sales of Trilogy, and of course these games release to different install bases at different points, and Nintendo don't always report fully long-term sales. Still, let's assume that the same rough ratio applies, and that Metroid is able to scoop about a fifth of Bonanza's sales. Transposing that ratio across would make it 0.7 million on the Bonanza install base and 1 million with the benefit of the new people who have come on board. Of course, some people will purchase the game on Switch as well. About half of ZA's sales were Switch 2, but I'd anticipate a higher portion of the Metroid Prime 4 sales will be Switch 2 because it's a far more graphically impressive game, and while Pokemon has always been targeted towards older hardware, Metroid Dread proved that the series could be used to launch new hardware. Let's assume, therefore, that the balance is more like 3/4, in which case my central estimate for sales in the first month could be inflated to something to the region of 1.3 million. Now, of course, you might say that I'm effectively double counting here because you could say that the 1 million should include Switch sales as well, but I think there's also a reasonable case to be made that there will be an early adopter premium from people who are interested in the technology of the Switch 2 and want a game that is graphically impressive, and particularly a first-party game, to showcase what their new purchase has bought them. That 1.3 million number would be considered by Nintendo rather good, I think. True, Metroid Prime 4 was a huge outlay in costs with its 9-year dev cycle, but it would at least keep it at a consistent level with Xenoblade and give it a chance for long-term sales. The question, of course, is whether it can match those sales for the longer term. Metroid Dread sold 2.74 million in its first quarter, meaning that while it had a strong start, it didn't show long-term traction. On the other hand, Xenoblade Chronicles 2 sold 1.06 million in its first quarter, and like Metroid Prime 4, it also released right at the start of December. That game went on to sell at last count 2.7 million, and by now possibly 3 million. A roughly 300% uplift in a generation would put the massively improbable upper tram line of sales at 13 million in the generation, but if we go from the central estimate, it will be closer to the 3 to 4 million range, possibly topping Metroid Prime. However, I suspect Xenoblade Chronicles 2 was slightly helped by the real lack of early first-party Switch support, whereas Switch 2 has had nearly a decade of classic titles to fall back on. This is also the reason why I don't imagine we'll get the same kind of sales explosion that the very first game got on GameCube. Still, even if Metroid Prime 4 achieves half this uplift and can secure, let's say, 2.5 to 3 million by the end of the decade, it will have put itself in the category of solid, middle-selling titles that historically have been staples of Nintendo's game lineup. Now, I tried to put forecasts in percentage terms for the purpose of calibrating my judgment going forward, so let's try and look at it this way. I think there's a 90% chance that Metroid Prime 4 sales by the end of December are between 0.5 and 4 million across the two systems. I'd say there's a 30% chance that the sales will be between 1 and 1.7 million, by the end of December. I certainly think Nintendo will go hell for leather to try to have it reach that magical 1 million number, just because I think they'll find it really beneficial to be able to talk about it. The risk with long-term sales forecasts, though, is that Nintendo doesn't always publish its annual sales when they're lower than 1 million, so I won't put a percentage on those at the current time. In the meantime, though, why not put your own Metroid Prime 4 sales forecast in the comments below? There's a lot of cool stuff on Patreon, some great videos on screen to check out, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.